Good afternoon and welcome to today's webcast. I'm delighted to be joined in our studios again by Mr. Claudio Fernández-Aráoz, author of Great People Decisions. Claudio, many thanks for coming back to see us again today.
Thanks so much, Paul, to you.
So last week we looked at different aspects from your new book, Great People Decisions. Maybe for people who weren't able to join us, could you give us a quick overview of some of the key messages we looked at last week?
Yes, well, the most important message was about why making great people decisions matters so much. And by great people decisions, I mean great appointments, whether it is promoting someone from within or hiring someone from outside. And the most important message is that making great people decisions is the most important factor for our career success. Especially when you are a manager, nothing is more important for your career success than making great people decisions. Because everything that you do will depend on the people you've chosen. Your results, your performance, your risks, your chances of being promoted because of the successors you'll have developed. That's the most important message for our career success. In addition, research increasingly shows that making great people decisions is the most important controllable factor for the value of our organizations. That was the most important message of last week.
Okay, so key for personal career success, key for the value of our company. We promised last week that we would look at 3 questions today, that we'd look at what you should be looking for when you're hiring people, where you can find those people, and how you can assess them. And I know we're going to get to that in some detail as we go on. But right at the end of last week's webcast, you talked about 4 fundamental pillars which kind of underlay everything that we're talking about today. Could you maybe just refresh that for us?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, the most important point I made, Paul, is that it is very important that we get ourselves educated for making great people decisions. Why is this so? Because we are not naturally equipped to make great people decisions. We have an old brain for a new job. The world has changed a lot, and our brains still react instinctively. They react in an unconscious way, and we basically make these decisions based on snap judgments, which are long on snap and short on judgment, based on first impressions. We tend to surround ourselves with similar people rather than doing the homework. So the first thing is to educate ourselves so that we can learn how to make people decisions. In spite of what most people think, making great people decisions is not an art, is not the result of an intuition, it's a craft and a discipline that can be learned and should be learned. Second recommendation was to adopt a new mindset, to use in these people decisions the same level of professionalism, of analysis, of science that we in fact use for other types of decisions, such as financial decisions, marketing decisions, strategic decisions. Adopting a new mindset, realizing that 70% of the value of the typical company today is intangible assets. So we should use all the rigor when making these decisions. The third recommendation was to, in the processes, particularly in the hiring processes, to cut the red tape. It is very frequent to have companies having, say, 10 people or more interview candidates. Some of those interviewers are not well qualified for that. So the best practice recommendation is to involve 3 or 4 high caliber people so that you avoid the 2 risks that you can have when making people decisions. One risk is hiring the wrong person. That's why you need educated people and more than one of them. But the other risk is killing the right candidate for the wrong reason. Rejecting that exceptional star based on a poor assessment which may be in short supply. That's what I mean by cutting the red tape, involving 3 or 4 high caliber people in this decision. And the final recommendation at the level is to basically make sure to follow with discipline a proven process, because the good news is that, as I said, making great people decisions, it's a craft and a discipline that can be learned and should be learned. And there is a proven process which I try to explain clearly in the book for making these decisions, which includes deciding when a people change is needed, what to look for in a candidate, where to look for candidates, how to assess them, how to attract, retain and motivate them, and how to properly integrate them into the new job.
Okay, so let's look at some of the aspects of that process. We said that we're going to look today at what you should be looking for when you're hiring people, and often there's a debate. People ask, should you hire for skills? Should you hire for attitude? Should you be looking for both? Is that possible? What would you say, based on your experience, that you should? What are the key elements you should be looking for when you're hiring somebody?
Well, first of all, regarding what to look for in a candidate, it depends for the job. Each job requires specific characteristics. Now, if I have to make one generalization, that generalization would be that in addition, of course, to looking at experience and to looking at IQ, which is highly correlated with educational background, you should make sure that the person is strong in those competencies which are based on what has been called emotional intelligence. By emotional intelligence, I mean the ability to properly manage ourselves and our relationship with others. Mm-hmm. And this concept, which became quite well known when Daniel Goleman published that landmark book called Emotional Intelligence, which sold 5 million copies. In 1995, it was in the cover of Time magazine, and it said the book that redefines what it means to be smart. When that book got published, I got in touch with Dan Goleman. I really was impressed by his research and by the book, and I tried to do some analysis to see whether this would apply to my own work as an executive search consultant. Mm-hmm. And also he became interested to see whether the research would apply to different cultures. And so what I did at this point in time, which is the way in which I want to emphasize the point on what to look for in a candidate, is I basically looked at all the candidates that I had hired during my first 10 or 12 years as an executive search consultant. There were close to 250 candidates I have hired. I did classify these candidates in successful cases and failures, which I had and I still have, because as Jack Welch would say, making great people decisions is brutally hard. So luckily the failures were about slightly less than 10%, but out of 250 there were still a significant number of cases to make the analysis. And what I did was try to see what was the profile of the successes and the failures, and I looked at 3 broad categories. One was how relevant was their experience before being hired, and by experience it was not just industry experience, it was also situational experience, such as turnaround versus startup versus managing a cyclical business. I looked at IQ, which is, as I say, highly correlated with educational background, and I looked finally at emotional intelligence, the ability to manage ourselves and our relationship with others, which in the world of work meant capabilities such as self-awareness of our strengths and weaknesses, integrity, self-control, initiative, optimism, the ability to motivate ourselves, adaptability, flexibility, then social awareness, empathy, understanding others, social and political awareness, and then all of these relational skills which are so important in the world of work, such as leadership, teamwork, conflict resolution, influencing others with integrity, and so on. I did the analysis, which in a minute I'll share with the audience and with yourself, and then Dan Goleman became extremely interested. I did it for the work I was doing those days in Latin America about 2 other very different cultures, one of it being Japan and the other one being Germany. And this is basically the result of what I found of the profiles of the successes in those cultures. If you look at it, you find that the most important characteristics of the successes were emotional intelligence competencies, closely followed by experience, and the least important factor in relative terms was IQ, traditional verbal analytical intelligence. Then I looked at the profile of the failures, and it's even more dramatic. If you look at it, the failures on average were extremely strong in their experience, more so than the successes. They were significantly more intelligent in the traditional sense than the successes, but they failed because of their low emotional intelligence. So, to sum this up, what you should be looking for in a candidate, first question. Make sure that in addition to looking at the hard, which is the experience and the educational background, you also look at the soft, because the soft has become hard.
Mm-hmm.
Make sure that you check for those emotional intelligence-based competencies, because as we say in our profession, people get hired because of their experience, but they get fired because of the way in which they manage themselves and the relationship with others.
Okay. My guess is that there are people watching today who are there's probably a collective sigh at the other end of the camera now saying, well, that's great. It's great that we know we should be looking at emotional intelligence, but how on earth do we do that? That's a pretty tall order. You talked about self-awareness, you talked about leadership, you talked about teamwork, you talked about empathy. There was a whole big long list there. How can I possibly be looking for that when I'm interviewing somebody?
Measuring that. Well, the first important point, and it sounds technical, but I will explain it in simple terms, is that emotional intelligence, unlike IQ, is not an index, it's an inventory. What do I mean by this? IQ is basically an index, which is a measure of some capabilities which are very highly intercorrelated, such as verbal, analytical type of intelligence. Emotional intelligence is the aggregation of a series of competencies, such as the ones I've mentioned, some of which may be very relevant for some jobs, and others may be less relevant. So the first thing that you need to do is to identify which one of these are relevant for a job. And you should avoid the temptation of asking everyone, what do you want in the ideal candidate? And then you build a list of specifications, which is the combination of Superman, Batman, and Spider-Man for the salary of Superdog, and nobody's going to be able to solve that people decision. So you focus on what are the challenges, what are the managerial priorities, what competencies are important, and at what level. For example, if you are looking for the ability to influence others, which is an emotional intelligence-based competence, influencing others with integrity without the formal power. What are the type of people that need to be influenced, how tough the challenge is, and so on. And then, once you have this list of the 5, 6, or 7 key competencies, what you do is you measure them in two ways. The first way is through well-structured interviews, where you try to find out that the person has done in the past things which are similar to what needs to be done. For example, if you are looking for a project manager that needs to work under intense time pressure, and you are interviewing project managers as candidates, you should try to find whether the person in the past has been in a situation where he or she had to manage a project under a tight deadline. And then you say, okay, have you ever been in a role like this? What were the circumstances? What was your role? What did you do? How did you do it? What were the consequences? This is the first thing that you need to do. Second, you need to complement this with reference checking. Speaking with people who have seen the person in action in those circumstances. And this you need to do for 3 reasons. First, because in some cases, people just misrepresent their achievements. Second, even if people are honest, there's lots of research that shows that we are very optimistic. There's research that is like 50 years old that shows that depressive people are pretty accurate on their self-assessment. Non-depressive people are extremely optimistic. For example, last year there was an issue of Business Week that was based on a poll of 2,000 Americans. They were middle managers and senior executives. One of the questions was, within your own level, are you in the top 10%? Statistically, you would expect 10% to respond that. 90% of Americans believe that they are in the top 10%. So the second reason why you need a reference checking is to make sure that you get an objective assessment of the person in front. And finally, a reference check would provide information not only to decide whether to hire the person, but also which areas need some support in terms of development or complementing their team.
Okay, so structured interviews, and I know in your book you even give some examples of questions that people can use. Reference checks, which you've just talked about. There may be people saying today, what about psychometrics? You know, often when I apply for a job or we have people coming through, I'm asked to fill out questionnaires, sometimes multiple questionnaires. What's your feeling in psychometrics? Does this make sense? Are they a really good predictor today of future success? Which combination of psychometrics are you looking for? Do they play a role in great people decisions?
Good question. Well, when you are hiring at the base of the pyramid, where people don't have a working experience, then things such as academic background, the academic record, GPA, and psychometrics, the right ones, interpreted by the right people, because sometimes the person applying the instrument is more important than the instrument itself.
Right.
They play a role. Now, when you are looking for a senior position, the limitations of psychometrics is that they are not job specific. And that's why they typically have a validity of about 0.3, which is about the validity of an unstructured interview, but which is much lower than the validity of a well-structured interview.
Okay.
And let me give you just an example. For example, if I ask you, Paul, is being obsessive-compulsive good or bad? Well, most people in the audience, I'm sure, say, well, that's bad. For a leader, that's very bad. But if I want a brain surgeon to operate on my brain, I don't want that person to get distracted when he's fooling around with my brain. If you want a controller, sometimes being obsessive is very good. So that's one of the reasons why at the very high level psychometrics don't have enough validity, because they are not job specific. But in the initial levels they can play a role. Okay.
What about the maybe people today looking at this and saying, well, should I be looking outside the organization when I'm trying to fill a key position? Should I be looking for within? Should I have a balance of candidates from both parts? Are there any golden rules about hiring from within or from without the organizations?
It's an excellent question, because last year we did in our firm a global study on senior talent where we did interview 50 CEOs from some of the largest global companies as well as most of the top HR leaders. And when we asked this question about what is best to actually promote from within or hire from outside, we found that most people say, well, it's much better to promote from within, and I consider myself a failure if I am not able to do that. Other people, a minority, would say, no, it's very good to get some fresh blood so that you bring some new ideas, so that you get challenged in what you do, and so that you bring creativity and new complementary skills. But when we asked these people, why do you say that this is better? Their answer was, because it's better. So there was no clear research in that. And there has been some wonderful research on this, which I want to share on what is the second question, where to look for candidates. The research basically shows the following. I remember once asking, for example, Jack Welch the question, you know that GE is a factory of talent, being so large and having worked on doing outstanding hiring and outstanding development for over a century really, of course you would expect that most candidates get promoted from within. And in fact they are. But as Jack Welch would share with me, whenever they would enter into a completely new arena, such as when launching the new plastics division or the ultrasound business of the medical division, after failing several times they realized that they needed someone who understands the job. But in addition to the case of when you don't have the knowledge inside, let me share with you and the audience what is the best practice on where to look for candidates. Now, if you look at the research, what research basically shows is that when you promote someone from within, typically the value of the organization doesn't change, which is not bad. If the organization is doing well, it remains. On average, if the company is doing poorly, an indication of which is that, for example, the predecessor is fired, then bringing an outsider typically adds value, like 5 percentage points of return on net assets. Why? Because insiders who are not able to solve the problem, there is a mandate for change. People inside are concerned. They say, we may go bankrupt, we may be downsized, we may be fired, we may be acquired, and so there is a mandate for change. On the other hand, on average, if the company is doing very well and you parachute a foreigner, people don't welcome the stranger. They throw banana skins so that he or she would break their neck on the first steps towards the corner office. And so research shows that on average they destroy value, about 5 percentage points of return on net assets. Now, these are the average conclusions. I have done some analysis on the spread, and this is basically the result. The result shows that, for example, when you are promoting an insider, in the case of a natural succession, the best promotions are outstanding, and these people can add up to 40 percentage points of return on net assets. But even in that same situation, the wrong insiders, even when things were going well, can destroy enormous value, something like 40 percentage points of return on net assets. The same applies when you look at the other combinations of bringing an insider or an outsider. For example, as I said, when things were not going well, which is the last bar, you hire an outsider when the predecessor was fired. On average, you can see that they are about 5 percentage points of return on net assets.
Okay.
But the wrong outsiders destroy almost twice that value.
Okay.
So the conclusion is that you can really get it right or wrong with any combination of insider or outsider. So what's the conclusion? The conclusion is that if it's a senior position, the best practice is to always consider a large pool of candidates, both insiders and outsiders, and appoint the best, regardless of where it comes from. There is some wonderful research by the Center for Creative Leadership that precisely shows that the most successful selections are those that consider a wide pool of candidates, both insiders and outsiders. And there are 3 reasons why that is the case. First, if you look at the larger pool, the probability of finding the best is larger. We are here in front of this wonderful lake. If I fish in the whole lake, the probability of getting the larger trout is larger than if I just fish in one spot. Second, when you look at the diverse pool of candidates, you can realize that there were some characteristics that you hadn't thought about, which are crucial, or that you didn't know that would exist. And so it allows you to make a more informed and better decision. And finally, from a motivational point of view, it is much better, because if in the end you hire an outsider, at least you've given your inside candidates the best chance. And if you promote someone from within, you are sure that there is no one out there who is better, and that also increases your commitment for a successful appointment.
Okay. What about people who are watching today who may naturally almost turn to an executive search firm like yourselves, like Egon, Zehnder International? When it comes to a key position, they think this is almost a guarantee or an additional guarantee for us that we're going to have the right person in the right place. What do you see as the advantages of going through that kind of process? And I'm guessing you're going to be able to tell us plenty of those, but are there pitfalls of going through that process too?
Yes. Well, first of all, Paul, when I wrote the book to try to help everyone make better people decisions, whether promoting from within or hiring from outside, with or without professional help. Okay. And that's why the book is a reference so that you can develop your skill at that. Let me try to give you, as much as I can be objective, being an executive search consultant, some generalizations. So, first, if it's a very senior position, the impact of that decision is so large that it really pays to work together with specialists so that you make sure that you consider a wider pool, that you have specialists participating in the assessment and also in the attraction of some candidate who may not be looking for a job, but if you still want to get the best one, it helps doing that. As I was saying last week, research has shown that the impact of company value of making a great CEO decision can be in the order of $1 billion to $10 billion for a large company. You know that this happens in practice. For example, whenever a senior executive from GE, which is considered a factory of talent, leaves GE and becomes the CEO of another company, the market value of this second company instantly spikes, at least by $1 billion and in some cases by $10 billion. So if it's a very senior position, it pays to make a small investment so that you make sure that you consider a wide pool of talent, that you have experts assessing, experts helping you motivate candidates who may not be looking for a job, and also for a very senior position you have the advantage of the confidentiality of the process, because sometimes the organization doesn't want to make public that such a key position is vacant or is not properly covered. And also executives don't want to risk their current situation, particularly if they were not looking for a job. Now, those could be the advantages for the high-level position. Okay. However, a couple of considerations. When an organization is very frequently looking for a similar type of position, and that happens more at the lower levels where you have a larger number of positions and there are more standards, probably the organization knows the competencies required, confidentiality is not such an issue, so they can advertise and people right out of school or business school would apply, and they would have internal resources. So in that case, it does make sense. There are some other cases where the pool of candidate is so obvious and so limited that it doesn't make sense to do it through an executive search firm. Now, if you do it with the help of an executive search firm, two recommendations I would give would be very important. First, this is a partnering effort. You would never outsource this. It is, in the end, the organization, the one that has to make an informed decision, and so this should be considered partnering. Second, it is very important to avoid conflicts of interest in the way in which the relationship is structured. For example, if you retain an executive search firm and you pay them with a contingency fee where they just collect if you hire the person they present, they have an incentive to present all the strengths of the candidate and not the weaknesses. This is not good. So executive search firms should be compensated with a retainer fee where their fee should be independent of whether in the end you hire someone from outside or you promote someone from within, and you can have them assess both type of candidates. And the second type of conflict of interest to avoid is what is called the percentage fee. There is a very common practice where sometimes executive search firms collect 1/3 of the cash compensation of the candidate. If you do that, it's an inherent conflict of interest because you have the temptation to present the most expensive candidates rather than the most convenient ones. So I would warn against those two conditions, and I would recommend working with a retainer fixed fee if you go to an executive search firm.
Claudio, we talked a lot last week about the difference between nature and nurture, and how do these skills, is this something that everybody can learn? Presumably, in your book, one of the reasons for doing it is that you have a fundamental belief that these skills can be learned by anybody.
Yes, I am convinced about this from several points of view. One is, in fact, my own case. I was a management consultant working for McKinsey. I wasn't thinking about this profession. I was attracted by a firm, by the people. I was trained, and I learned how to make this decision. And the same things happens to everyone in our firm. We typically hire people who either come from human resources or from other search firms. They come from management consulting, from a career towards a general management position. We train them, and we made a firm which is successful at assessing people, so we are the living proof that this can happen. But do you want me to tell you what's the difference between the best assessors and the worst assessors, and how you can develop? Because I think it's a crucial point, and it's related to the third question, which is how to assess people. Now, when speaking about how to assess people, most people would ask me, okay, Claudio, what's the best technique? What's the best tool? What's the best instrument? And there's 90 years of research on that, and I think we've covered that previously when saying it's a combination of defining the relevant competencies, using structured interviews with a high caliber assessor, and complementing that with reference check. That's the technique. But the point that I make is that even more important than the instrument is the person applying the instrument. For example, I'm a lousy piano player. You bring the best piano in the world, I start playing, and you will escape even in the middle of this conversation. You bring here an average piano and a great player, and it will be a delight. So I want to share with you and illustrate dramatically that in order to make great people decisions, in order to assess people rigorously, organizations need to apply the best practices that I describe in the book, but they also should make sure to involve the right people. And so let me show this by one of the best pieces of research I know about the validity of the different interviewers. The validity basically is the way to measure the accuracy of an interviewer. So if there is an interviewer who always gets it right, that would be the case of God. God knows everything. He or she cannot lie. So if God says, you are a great candidate, you will be a great candidate. And if God says, he's a lousy candidate, I will be a lousy candidate. So the validity is basically the correlation coefficient between how a candidate is assessed by the interviewer and how the candidate performs on the job if he or she is hired. So the maximum value of a correlation coefficient is 1.0. And if I had the following assessment technique, Paul, I take a coin from my pocket and I flip the coin and I say great candidate, lousy candidate, great candidate, lousy candidate. There is no correlation between that assessment and performance, and so the correlation coefficient would be 0. That would be flipping a coin. Now, let me show you the range of validities across different interviewers. The range of validities goes, the best interviewers have a validity of 0.7. the worst interviewers, as you can see, have a negative validity. They are worse than flipping a coin. And they still get executive search fees if they are executive search consultants, or salaries and bonuses if they are people working in an HR department of an organization assessing people. Now, think about what a negative validity means. It means that if you knew who that person was, you would always do the opposite of what he or she would recommend. So if we say, hire this person, fire him or her. You say, don't hire this person, hire her, promote her, develop her, retain her. So what is the problem of having interviewers with low validity? There are two problems. One problem is that you can hire the wrong person. But the other problem, which is less obvious but equally serious, is that a poor interviewer can kill the right candidate for the wrong reason, can reject that exceptional talent, that exceptional star, which is in such short supply. In the past, when talent was abundant, you would only care about not hiring the wrong person. But now, when talent has become scarce, particularly in the emerging markets, the cost of rejecting the right candidate for the wrong reason is very high. So, the conclusion on the point on how to assess people is make sure that you use the right tools and techniques, but also make sure that you involve the right people. Because if you look at this, there is a huge range. You should involve the right people. But the second thing is, if this is the range, where are we? Quite probably we are in the middle of that. 0.3 validity. 0.3 validity, this is a complex statistical explanation, but you need to square it. It means that this would only explain 9% of the variance in performance. It's very little. So, again, making people decisions is brutally hard. We are not very good because we have an old brain. The good news is that you can move from 0.3 to 0.7 if you get yourself educated in how to make great people decisions.
Claudio, we're running out of time. You're very passionate about what you do, and that comes across very clearly from the way that you talk. And I know you're very passionate about your country as well, and you come from Argentina. These ideas that we're talking about today, are these just applicable to the business arena, or is this something that you see a wider and a broader potential impact?
Well, Paul, it's a wonderful question, and it's a point that I like to emphasize, and it's wonderful to finish with this point, because when I was finishing the book, I was writing the last chapter, because the book, the first part is about why great people decisions matter so much, second part, why they are so hard, and most of the book basically is a how-to on each of these processes. But the last chapter is about the big picture, and it's about the social implications of making people decisions. And it's quite interesting, because when I was finishing the book, I sent an email to all our partners worldwide about the worst examples they have seen of people decisions, and more than 200 partners responded to me. And when I was thinking about corporations, about the corporate world, more than half of the examples were elections of country presidents, appointment of ministries, and so on. So this definitely applies not only for for-profit organizations, but even for electing country presidents. So let me make 3 points regarding the social implications of making great people decisions. First, there is an amazing blind spot. If you look at the history of business schools in America, by 1928 there were 34 business schools. All 34 were teaching accounting. None of them was teaching anything related to human resources except for 2. And with all respect to accountants, accounting is for analyzing the past. Making people decisions is for building the future. So the first thing is we should get educated on this. Second point that I want to emphasize is, these days with the problems of the financial meltdown, initially in the States and globally, everybody is focusing on some scandals. And we should do that. And we should fight corruption. We should fight fraud. When we had Enron and Tyco and WorldCom and Adelphia, thousands of people lost their jobs, their lifetime savings, billions of dollars were distracted. The estimate in the US of the cost of corporate fraud is 5% of GDP, which is $700 billion, which is a fortune. It's the size of this huge bailout package. The point I make is that there is a hidden scandal, which is much worse than this, about which nobody speaks about, which is the multitude of cases where you have incompetent people in senior positions. And that's orders of magnitude larger. Let me just quantify it with a couple of examples. If you look at a simple job, a blue-collar manual worker in an assembly line, you have a distribution of productivity. If the average productivity is 100, the star workers would be 40% more productive. Compare that 40% opportunity cost with a 5% of corporate fraud. For more complex positions, the spread between a typical worker and a star grows exponentially. So for an insurance salesman, a star would be 240% more productive. Compare 240% opportunity cost with 5% of corporate. For a more complex position, computer programmer, the spread would be larger than 1,000%. So the second point I want to emphasize is that there is a moral obligation to make great people decisions, because the impact on society is huge. And the last point that I want to emphasize is that I believe that the whole population should at least be educated about the impact of making great people decisions, as a result of which individuals will be more successful in their careers, corporations will be more valuable, countries will be better run, and as a result of this, the whole world will be a much better place.
Claudio, that's a great place to leave it. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Paul.
As I say, I think your passion for this subject really comes through. I think it's really infectious, and I hope and I believe that will come through in the webcast for our viewers who are watching virtually today. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Paul.
Really
I wish you and all the audience many great people decisions.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
I hope you found that useful. If you'd like to go a little bit further with that, you can click on the link just below your screen, and there you'll find a link to Claudio's book. It's a really great and very practical book, as Claudio said, a really how-to guide in terms of great people decisions. So if you'd like to take that further, do please go ahead and click on the link. If you're new to the webcast and you're interested to find out how you can access these webcasts on a regular basis and become part of IMD's Corporate Learning Network, again, click on those link buttons and you'll find all the information you need there. From all of us here at IMD, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again shortly. Bye-bye.